Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. It's been a little while since we've done an episode, but we're glad to be back at it. And
back on the horse.
Yes, and I am joined by the proverbial horseman, Mr. Martin Yates.
Mike, how are you?
I'm good, except that we've just had, in the run-up to this episode, in the last 30 minutes, I've managed to smash a glass clock and then damage my microphone somehow.
As long as the next thing you break doesn't rhyme, then you're good.
Yeah. So that's been it. How have you been?
Yeah, I'm good. Believe it or not, I still haven't been back to my place of work. Still sitting in the house. They keep changing their mind, health and safety, back and forth. So it's a kind of weird situation now because at any minute, okay, come back into work and then something resembling normal life resumes, which I have to say, I'm in no great rush for that, but return to work keeps getting put off, so I kind of don't know whether I'm coming or going.
I know people who, they're still going to do bits and bobs of work, but their offices aren't going to open until next year. They've already been told that. Their offices won't open, and that's in the public services. Like my wife, she works in the council, she's not back yet, but she's been told it's probably going to be the beginning of September, but she still hasn't been given a start date yet. They're still trying to figure out all the logistics of it, and I think they're also looking at things to be like, is this about to all kick off again?
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. The problem is a lot of time critical stuff that needs to be dealt with at work, and although I'm in no rush to go back, if we don't get back within the next week or two, there's going to be like a whole trainload of shit to deal with when we do get back.
Yeah, for me, I'm still a freelance writer, but I've had to completely change my business, completely, what I do. And that's been good in some ways, but it's like I've been having to hold off on getting paid for certain things. But this is very boring. Why don't we get into the mystery, Martin, of tunnels under the ground? Are you ready, Martin? Are you ready to once more delve into the unknown?
Once more into the breach, yes.
So tonight's episode is going to be slightly different because it's dealing with recent archaeological finds, but there's great mystery in that. It may even lead us in some very strange directions. We're hoping that you will all enjoy it. So, ever since I was a wee boy, I've been fascinated by mysterious places, whether it was far-flung jungles hiding the relics of forgotten civilizations, or the sprawling landscapes of places where no one has gone before. Deliberate Star Trek reference for you there. But the mysterious places which captured my attention the most are those beneath the surface of the Earth. Growing up, I would devour any stories I could get my hands on about the hidden subterranean world. This included accounts of cryptids like the Mongolian death worm, or stories about the vast networks of caves where the bones of our ancestors were laid to rest, and even the more speculative tales of a hollow earth or a Wellesian world at the Earth's core. As an adult, I may be more critical about the speculative accounts describing these subterranean landscapes, knowing full well that the chances of meeting advanced civilizations or lively dinosaurs down there are probably more a fantasy than reality. However, we needn't abandon all mysteries of the world beneath our feet quite just yet. What about you, Martin? Were you interested in things that went on beneath the ground?
I am looking right now at this again. This is probably going to be another episode that we do eventually. I'm looking right now at a book by a chap called Warren Smith called This Hollow Earth.
Yeah.
So yeah, when you mentioned the Hollow Earth, not a big believer nowadays, but that book fascinated me as a kid. And there's a particular, what's called the Shaver mystery. I actually think that would be a fantastic future episode. But 100%. This is right up my street.
So there are strange tunnels carved out of the rock in our homeland of Scotland, and possibly as far flung as Turkey, to keep our detective brains alive with possibilities. Indeed, most of them can be found under the cities and towns of modern-day Europe, and they continue to perplex archaeologists because they seem to be of similar origin or design. So who carved them? What was their purpose? And what remains hidden in those we are yet to explore? And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. Most of the serious excavation and exploration of these tunnels has taken place in Germany, and it's for this reason that they've been given a German name. They are known as Erdstalls. I will use the English pronunciation of Erdstalls from here in just in case I've got that wrong. So we'll be calling them Erdstalls, everyone.
Erdstalls!
There are various theories behind the name. The word erd can mean soil or ground, and stall obviously means stable, but it can also mean spot or location. So interestingly, in places like Saldenberg, which is an area in the south of Germany in Bavaria, they are often referred to as Schrazelgang. Now this should get curiosity going because that word is derived from Schrazeln, which is a specific creature or spirit from German and other European folklores which is said to live beneath the ground. And so already we have some tantalising lore behind the tunnels which suggest ancient peoples believed the underground passages to be the realms of supernatural or cryptid creatures.
Yeah, well, it's like a lot of historical belief in fae people, the little people, come back to them being underground dwellers. Even if you look at stuff that's influenced by that, like Lord of the Rings, the dwarfs in the mines, that's all tied in with that kind of mythology.
Don't get me started on Lord of the Rings, man.
No, don't start on Lord of the Rings.
Don't get me started, because we'll be here all evening. I'm fascinated also by amateur scientists and the stories behind their discoveries. Often it's those with a passion for an area of inquiry who push the envelope and bring new data into scientific focus. This is no truer than with the man who pioneered exploration of Erdstalls. He was a priest named Lambert Karner, and during the late 1800s recorded his adventures in his journal. An article in German magazine Der Spiegel, which we'll talk about at great lengths during this episode because it's one of the best sources I've found on this, states that he, and I quote, crawled through 400 vaults lit only by flickering candlelight, with strange winding passages through which one can often only force oneself like a worm. I don't know about you, Martin, but the image of a priest opening up these dark, forgotten tunnels by himself with only a candle for company feels like something straight out of Lovecraftian fiction.
Yeah, there's some jokes there that I'm just not gonna lower myself to. Not tonight.
Could be a lot here, but I've definitely sidestepped. So the sheer number of these tunnels is mind-blowing. In fact, in Bavaria alone, over 700 have been discovered. These tunnels have also been found right across the continent, and it's estimated that the majority of them are still out there to be explored. We have no idea of just how many of these structures exist down there. It's important here to make a distinction between a normal tunnel and an Erdstall. Human beings have created underground structures for thousands of years, possibly even stemming back to before Homo sapiens arrived. But we can't just lump all of these structures together and say that somehow they're part of the one mystery.
Yeah.
So an underground burial chamber beneath a cairn in Scotland is not the same thing as a secret smuggler's cellar underneath a 16th century coastal house. Just because there are structures underground doesn't mean they are all the same thing. However, there are striking similarities which seem to link Erdstalls to each other, if not physically some of the time, then in concept and execution. They have a very unique set of characteristics which suggest that they have, at the very least, been carved using the same technology or approach, and perhaps most enticing of all, that they've been created for the very same purpose, but we just don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's so creepy.
Yeah,
I don't know. If it was on the surface, you'd be like, yeah, there's some buildings over there, we don't really know what they are. That's kind of interesting, but I don't really care. But you go, yeah, there's a tunnel underground. We don't know what it's for or where it goes. Instantly, the bristles on the back of your neck go up, you know? Yeah.
That flat that you nearly bought.
Depth unknown.
I think about that a lot, where like you're given the call report.
Yeah, so what happens was we were looking to buy a flat in Glasgow. Before we bought the flat that we currently live in, we were looking at a flat in North Kelvinside. And when you're going through the process of buying a property in Glasgow, because the Glasgow area has been so heavily mined and quarried over centuries and centuries, because there's coal seams, there's ironstone, there's various minerals here that have over the years been mined, and in a lot of cases before there was really good historical records, so people would maybe just own a bit of land and start digging. So there's something called the coal report that you get when you purchase a property here. Over the years, surveys have been done of the land to identify where these old mine entrances were, because they cause issues with subsidence. So these old mine entrances may have been filled in 200-300 years ago, but over time the rubble that has been used to fill them in maybe settles, or it floods and collapses. There's been tales of the foundations of apartment blocks just disappearing into the bowels of the earth. So you get this thing called the coal report that tells you where the nearest mine entrances are, if there's anything that might pose a risk, so that you're buying the place. And I'm sure everything's going to be okay. It doesn't happen very often that there's like a big sinkhole opens up, but just for your own peace of mind, you have this, and you have an option to pull out if you're not happy with what it says. And so we got the lawyer said to us, the coal report came back. There is a mine entrance within whatever it was, 50 metres of the property, just to let you know. It's probably nothing worth worrying about. And then just kind of moved on to something. I thought, well, let's actually have a look at this coal report. And it shows you a little map, and it shows you where the flat was that we were buying. And I can't see where the mine entrance is on this. I see the flat that we were in the process of buying. I see a little X that indicates that that's our flat, but I can't see the actual entrance to this mine. And then I realised that the little X was the entrance to the mine, and the entrance to the mine was like directly beneath the bedroom of the flat that we bought, and it just said depth unknown. Do you know, I'm just not. There was a few other problems with the place, but we ended up actually pulling out partly because of that. But
no wonder.
We have to legally tell you there's a fucking haunted mine shaft under here, but don't you worry about that. The fact that they kind of kept it from us until the very last minute kind of spooked us a little bit.
Yeah, there's like, what else are they not telling
you?
you?
So we ended up not going for that, but yeah, that's my experience of tunnel.
The thing is, and we're going on tangents here, but I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you, maybe it's an embarrassing story. When I was a kid, and see, to be honest, wasn't a really young kid, right? I must have been in my teens, maybe 13, 14.
21. Mm-hmm.
I got into my head that, we've mentioned this in the podcast before, the hill that I grew up on, there were houses there, I didn't just grow up on a hill, but it's probably about the highest point in Glasgow looking over, so it's certainly one of them. And I sort of had in my head that for some reason at the back of the garden I would dig down into the ground. This became the talk of like neighbours and friends. They'd actually come round to be like, how far down?
So you had started, you'd actually started going.
Yo, aye. I was like 6 feet down at one point, Martin.
It's halfway to Australia, mate. Well done.
I know. And I was telling people that I just wanted to see how low down I could go. But I had in my head that I would either come upon a forgotten shaft of some description, or I would make my own. Right. This is the way my brain worked. And the reason that I stopped digging down wasn't because I gave up.
Right.
Some people were like, oh, did you give that up? And I'm like, yeah, I got about 6 feet down and I just decided, nah. What actually happened is I broke through a pipe. But here's the thing, I think it was an old clay pipe, and it was like just a drainage pipe that maybe had been laid to take water off the hill.
Right.
There was a little bit where I was just like, are people all of a sudden going to be like, my toilet's not working? I would assume that hill has been, I think they were like exploratory tunnels.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're getting sidetracked here. So what makes a tunnel an Erdstall? The first is that they are pretty small. This only adds to their mystery, as they are notoriously difficult to navigate for grown adults. And it's also easy to see then why folkloric explanations talk about strange creatures inhabiting them, sometimes evoking many mythological accounts of small humanoids, like you mentioned, Martin, elves, goblins, dwarves, gnomes, that sort of thing. Erdstalls are often about 1 to 1.4 metres in height. That's about 3 foot 3 inches to 4 foot 7 inches, respectively.
Not built to human scale then, particularly, because even back then, under 4 feet is small. You know, you can't stand upright in them, I'm assuming. Yeah,
like some of them have little portions where you can, but then there's others that just you can't at all. So, like, most people could probably crawl through these spaces or even hunch down. Not you, Martin. You're beautifully tall. But when I tell you that these tunnels are only about 60 centimetres, just 24 inches wide, you realise how claustrophobic and difficult they must be to explore, especially if you're carrying any kind of equipment with you down there or excavating the tunnels as part of a research team. You can kind of see why our intrepid priest that we mentioned earlier was going in there maybe with nothing but a torch or a candle.
Yeah. Dangerous though. Dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine that collapse. Imagine you were down there in the dark and
not knowing where you're going. Plus, there's water, there's collapse danger, but there's also the danger of falling down something that you don't see there. Or oxygen problems as well happen. Miners encounter those things all the time.
How deep are we talking with these? How deep do these go then?
They're not, as far as I can tell, they tend to only be a few meters down. This is why we're finding them, but then there could be ones deeper than that, we don't know. I mean, I guess we're still between sections of these tunnels. There are connecting segments known as a sloop or a slip out. These allow access from one set of tunnels to another, but they're tiny holes and require people of smaller stature and some athleticism to slide on their back or belly to get to the other side.
Yeah.
So they're really difficult to navigate through. So in terms of length, most of these tunnels are no more than 50 metres or 160 feet. There have been many misplaced claims that these tunnels, which number at least in the thousands, if not more, are actually all interconnected and reach from Scotland to Turkey, but pardon the pun, that's a stretch. It may be that some of these tunnel networks do connect, and we just haven't found those passages yet. But until
I think that may be running into like what you were talking about before about how do you parse it.
Yeah.
So if you go, okay, we know that these things exist and they seem to be, all these Erdstalls seem to be the one thing, but somebody's maybe not drawing the cut-off line quite so clearly.
Yeah.
We found something quite like it in Turkey, and we found something quite like it.
How
would you, through the mud of the North Sea, how are you going to have a tunnel? It's a stretch to imagine that. It would be cool though.
Oh, amazing.
It would make going on holiday cheaper. It'd be good for you because you wouldn't have to fly.
Yeah, 100%.
You just crawl on your belly onto the North Sea.
For 3 months.
Yeah.
So I'd file that under speculative, but it may also be that since the vast majority of the information surrounding Erdstalls is in German, that someone has mistranslated a few words and thought that researchers stated that they are connected when they're not.
Connected like in the terms of the concept, but not physically connected up.
Yeah, absolutely. So modern archaeology has tried to get at the heart of these tunnels. Rather than speculating about who or what made them, archaeologists are looking for solid evidence on which to base their claims. For me, who still at heart has that kid enthralled at what might be hidden beneath the earth, the fact that archaeologists are largely stumped by these tunnels makes the mystery all the more enticing. This is especially true when we, Martin, often deal with cases on Talking Till Dawn where people make extraordinary claims without any physical evidence. So here we are, discussing strange tunnel networks beneath the surface of Europe, and we know they're there because we found them.
Yeah.
That might sound like a silly observation, but when you immerse yourself in anomalous cases, 99% of the time, there's little to go on.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't an event that a couple of people witnessed and you go, well, what did they see?
Yeah.
You can go there, you can climb down, you can poke the wall with your finger, you can see that it's real and that someone has made it.
Yeah.
And just not know why.
And that's why you would go, because you want to poke the wall with your finger.
Yeah.
Normally, like with these things, there's little to go on, but here the archaeologists and prehistorians are doing a lot of work on this. I say prehistorians and historians. I was reading about that. I'm not even going to get into that whole thing. Just edit that out. So far, they've been able to distinguish 4 different types of Erdstall. Types A, B, C, and D. And this could mean that they have different purposes. And we'll get to the purposes or the potential purposes of what Erdstalls are and who made them. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's looking at the 4 types. So type A has a long room at its centre, and then shorter passages stem off of this central chamber, often sloping down further into the ground. Type B, and this type really fascinates me, these are multi-levelled structures. So they include the slip-out passages I mentioned before.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they're the ones you have to kind of shimmy through.
Yeah. Lying on your back or on your belly to get through. They work as a transition from higher to lower levels. So that seems to be their sort of purpose. So with Type B being a larger undertaking, archaeologists have found that there are other tunnels they suspect were used during the construction, but were then sealed.
Right.
So this is interesting because many other Erdstall types only have one perceivable entry point.
Right.
What also makes Type B Erdstalls so enthralling is that there are unusual cuts to the rock face in places. These resemble what look like seats or even benches where perhaps several people could have sat.
Right.
Whether this was to allow workers to rest or for some other purpose, we don't know. But looking at some of those structures in the walls, I've looked at some of the pictures and on the floors, and they look very strange indeed. I'm not sure I would immediately leap to the conclusion that all of them were for sitting. Some of them look quite unusual.
Right. In what sense? Like
they don't look comfy, Martin. They're not ergonomic.
Right. Okay.
There's no lumbar support. Some of the pictures that I saw, they look to be really shallow, the way they came out of the wall. So you're kind of looking at that and you're sitting thinking, and maybe
you're not going to get much of an arse on there.
Yeah, basically, yeah. You'd have to have a very small posterior. But again, that could be like a perspective thing. When you're taking a photograph of an underground cavern, you could photograph something and it could be massive but look small, and vice versa. So you don't.
There's no points of reference in the image, really.
Yeah. So that's Type B. And then there's Type C Erdstalls. They have slip passages that run in parallel with each other horizontally. There's also usually a circular tunnel that loops back on itself. And for some odd reason, the circular tunnels are the only ones where people can stand upright.
Right, so they're the taller section, but it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It doesn't do it. It doesn't seem to have any
They look back.
usable purpose.
Yeah.
Wow.
And finally, we have Type D Erdstalls, and these contain multiple chambers and are all connected with small passageways rather than having just like one central chamber with offshoots. So these seem to be the broad categories of Erdstalls that archaeologists are defining. So let's stick with the facts about these for now. What else have the archaeologists found? The answer, perplexingly, is very little. Determining how old Erdstalls are has proven difficult, if not near impossible. The reason for this is that archaeological ruins or structures are usually dated through different methods, but often through carbon dating methods. So I'm sure many of you listening, and I know you do, Martin, know how that works, but a quick summary is anything that has organic matter in it, whether it's skin or bone or plant material, etc., has a set amount of radioactive carbon within it. And when an animal or plant dies, this radioactive carbon goes into decay and diminishes. So the rate of that decay is well known, and so however much is left is a way to estimate the age. Now, there are some controversies about carbon dating, which I won't go into here, but it's widely accepted as a robust measurement in archaeology for dating things. But obviously the problem with using this method to determine the age of Erdstalls is that, one, because carbon dating only works with materials that were once part of a living organism, materials like stone, metal, or even pottery can't be dated using this method. So archaeologists have to rely on other methods. For example, pottery could be dated based on the technology used to create the pottery or the style involved. And when that's compared to our current understanding of when those styles and technologies were used, this can give you a ballpark figure for their age. But another way to date archaeological ruins is to uncover organic materials in and around those ruins. So for example, if a medieval hall is being unearthed, it can be dated based partially on the organic materials people left around the area at that time. So any wooden tools that might have been preserved, leather clothing,
food waste,
remnants of grain, other foods, even dead animals or dead people found on the site can allow for this type of dating. So that's the approach that researchers have taken with Erdstalls. Find the related organic relics left down there by the people who built and use the tunnels and then carbon date those. There's just one problem with that. Erdstalls are notoriously absent of relics. The passageways, chambers and slips are mostly empty. Where is the debris and litter? In fact, some researchers believe that most of these smaller tunnel systems dotted across many different countries have all been deliberately swept and cleaned up, removing the opportunity to accurately date them.
Yeah, I mean, in what condition were these found? Like, obviously, I'm assuming that the entrances are hidden. Are the entrances to these things hidden, or somewhat hidden, at least? Are many of them like graffitied? Are many of them, whatever their original purpose was, quite often things that, underground, even caves, old mine entrances and things, then become reused by people maybe seeking shelter and that kind of thing. Are there, as far as you know, are there many sort of instances of these being reused, whatever their unknown original purpose was? Have you come across anything?
Yeah, there have been a couple of instances that I've read about where I think they found a plough maybe in one.
Wow, right.
And some other materials, but it's very, very rare. It's like in 1 or 2 tunnels.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's the question of repurposing the tunnels, like you say. So just because they find something but I'll get to that actually in a minute, but just because they date something to a certain period, that doesn't mean that's when the tunnels were built.
Yes, right.
They may have been reused, but most of the time they've been sealed up, forgotten about, and that's how they're discovered. And they're not, to my knowledge, they're not largely, some of them have fallen in,
yeah,
but the ones that haven't are open, basically. Once they're discovered, they don't need to be fully excavated.
No, it'd be interesting to see if these things appear in areas with similar geology, like there's a certain stone type that's preferred, because obviously if it was sandstone or that, it wouldn't last very long. Be interesting if, like, I don't know, this is somehow tied up in the way certain people lived on the land, and obviously the land being the underlying geology, and people who shared similar, lived in areas with similar underlying bedrock. It'd be interesting just to see if it was limited to one type of stone.
Yeah, that's a real interesting idea, because when we talked about the Naha, who were the sort of legendary tribe that supposedly disappeared in the Nahanni Regional Park in Canada, I think we talked about some of the ground beneath the park, limestone materials, things like that created all these caverns naturally, and that maybe people could have went down there for their own safety. But anyway, so modern archaeology really is a marvel, and despite this huge mystery of why they may have been swept clean and how peoples from different cultures would have performed the same routine in doing so, fragments of organic materials have been discovered. In one tunnel particular, these fragments have been tested and they seem to be charcoal, dating back to between 950 and 1050 AD. So does that mean all Erdstalls were created 1,000 years ago? No, as we mentioned there. It doesn't even tell us that the Erdstalls, where those fragments were found, are definitively of that age.
Yeah.
But what it tells us is that of those tunnels containing the charcoal, and I think I'm right in saying it was only like 1 or 2 that they found this in, they are at least 1,000 years old.
It gives you a lower bound for the age of the tunnel.
Yeah. So for all we know, they could be much older, and those charcoal pieces were left there by explorers finding those tunnels 1,000 years ago, and explored some of them just as 21st century scientists and researchers are doing now.
Yeah. What about tool marks in terms of the actual chiseling out of the rock? Have you seen much about that side of it?
Yeah, there are some strange carvings into the rock that they think were for hanging lanterns.
Yeah, right.
But when it comes to like what was the specific tool, and was it the same tool that was used, and what period was that tool from, I haven't seen anything about that. I'm sure that's something that they would look at, but maybe there's just not enough evidence to go on with that. So I don't want to get too bogged down into dating methods. There are other such methods, such as dating the soil, covering areas, but with Erdstalls that doesn't necessarily apply, as these tunnels have been deliberately dug deep into the ground. They weren't covered over after the fact, like other mysterious constructions such as Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. So they could be 700 years old, or they could be 2,000 years old, and we wouldn't really know the difference. So when it comes to determining the age of Erdstalls, we simply don't know. All we can say is that they are, for want of a better word, ancient. But how ancient? Hopefully one day we'll find some definitive proof for that. And it's interesting because you mentioned this earlier, I think, about talking about the difference between something that's ancient and historical.
Yeah.
But I think, like, depending where you live, the definition is different. Like in America, I think something's considered ancient if it's only like a couple hundred years old.
Right.
So,
but 1,000 years old, these tunnels being built by people 1,000 years ago is still impressive.
Oh yeah.
I'm not saying it's beyond people's technological abilities. It wasn't, but it does show that people are putting a fair amount of resources into building these things, or someone or something is putting a lot of resources into building these things, which makes it more interesting that there aren't more records of them, that we don't have
this is
written records of why people were doing it.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it, and we'll definitely explore that.
Because you do expect, you go back far enough, not a lot of stuff's going to be written down. A lot of people weren't literate. But there would have been some stuff written down, and yes, a lot of that's going to be lost. But if these things are as truly as widespread as they're claimed to be, and obviously a lot of work and a lot of man hours have gone into building them, you would expect there to be something, but yeah.
That's what's fascinating about it, and that might lead to some of the things that I'll mention later, but perhaps one theory being that they're a lot older than recent times, or even within the last 1,000 years. So moving on from the age of the Erdstalls, let's focus a little of our time on why they were built. What was their purpose? The prospective answers to that question take us from the relatively mundane to the outright anomalous. That's where we live, man. So one theory is that the Erdstalls were built under castles, and that they were used as escape routes for when a castle was under attack and about to fall. It was a common tactic to starve out castle settlements surrounding them, so that the population inside would have to surrender eventually when facing starvation. So the Erdstalls then could have been a secret way to exit a castle, or perhaps just to hide.
Yeah.
Imagine disappearing through a secret entrance and then hiding while opposing forces took the castle, only to find it empty. But you would then wait until the coast was clear and then re-emerge.
Yeah.
Now, Martin, and I know you will have, because you're a rambler in the best possible way. Have you visited the castle at St Andrews?
Do you know what? I've never really spent much time in St Andrews. It's a pain in the arse to get to. I've been there once or twice. I've been to, there's an old abbey, an old ruined abbey or something there. Is it an abbey?
Yeah.
But I don't think I've been to the castle specifically, no.
So underneath what's left of the castle is this large ruin, but there's a mine and a counter mine. So right on our doorstep, so to speak, there are examples of tunnels running underneath castles. Now, in the case of the mine and counter mine at the gates of St Andrews Castle, one was dug during a siege in the 1500s where attackers hoped to put explosives under the castle walls and bring them down, and the counter mines were dug by those living in the castle to break into the attacking tunnel first and kill those digging before they could.
Much like the First World War, that was still happening up to then.
So were Erdstalls a form of attack to bring down ancient castles? Well, many Erdstalls, if not most, have been found under land that was part of a settlement, and in fact we even have some local folklore which might suggest this type of origin. In Bavaria itself, in a place called Beutelsbach, a man named Josef Wassmeyer had gathered stories about a grove of locust trees where legend had it that a castle once stood. Not only that, but accounts of tunnels from that long since vanished castle stated that a secret network of escape tunnels was carved underneath it. A friend of Wassmeyer's named Rudy Eichschmeid dug into the hillside beneath the grove of trees at night, mostly by moonlight, which must have been a very creepy undertaking, and finally uncovered an Erdstall with a vertical shaft going down 4 metres. So could those old folk tales be correct? And is it a tantalising clue to the origin of the tunnels themselves as long forgotten remnants of earlier forts and castles? Unfortunately, the castle hypothesis has, if you excuse the pun, many holes in it.
Here we go.
There are many Erdstalls without any evidence of significant ruins above them, and in some cases the Erdstalls branch out on their own away from settlements. So this explanation doesn't tick all the boxes.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Castles have tunnels, right? No one's disputing that. In areas where there are Erdstalls, there may also be castles that have their own tunnels. Okay, some tunnels may have been dug to get under castles, but then you'd have a castle above it.
Yeah.
And I find it hard to imagine that there wouldn't be either the remains of a castle, a big stone building like that, or at least memory and records of there being a castle. And what you're saying there's thousands upon thousands of these tunnels, so they can't all be built under castles.
I think the last estimate was over 2,000 have been found.
Right.
But they think, there may be, and I know I saw one researcher say that they thought 90% of them were still to be found. I don't know how they would come to that answer. Maybe there's a way that they could calculate it.
Maybe just looking at the rate of their discovery and
Yeah, which just boggles the mind how many of these things there might be.
Like, a lot of that might be just how you parse it, what you place under the heading of Erdstall.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe in certain areas where there's a tradition of people talking about them and saying we've discovered them in this area, people are more likely to lump any underground discovery into that. Whereas if it happened, say, here, or it happened, if somebody found a tunnel in America, it wouldn't necessarily be on people's minds.
Yeah.
What I'm getting at is, I guess you have to be kind of careful to make sure that when you say people discovered an Erdstall, that they did discover it. Is it the same thing? Have they actually discovered the same thing? And is actually finding one of these under a castle, does that actually make it less likely to be an Erdstall? Because then it's probably just something to do with this castle, and we shouldn't really get the two mixed up. I don't know. But it is interesting.
That's a great point. And I think like the 4 types that we mentioned beforehand, maybe that's one way that they differentiate them. But
because you mentioned before though that these have only, typically they've got one entrance, right?
Yeah, the larger ones, type B, I think. Type B has evidence of other tunnels that were later filled in.
Right.
And researchers think that perhaps they were used during the construction.
Yeah, okay.
And then filled in, so there was only one way in.
But in terms of it actually being strategically useful, if there's one entrance, then it makes it less useful. Okay, you might be able to go and hide there for a bit, but there's no way out. If someone finds the entrance to your secret hidey hole, you're in trouble.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll talk a little bit about the sort of defensive aspects of Erdstalls in a moment. Another explanation for the Erdstall tunnels is that they were built for food storage.
Mm-hmm.
We rely on freezers and refrigerators to keep our foods cool, to stop them from spoiling, but before such inventions existed, putting foods underground was a viable way to keep them fresh.
Yeah.
To begin with, the foods are kept away from sunshine. The ground is usually cooler than the surrounding air. I can testify to this, having slept on many a floor to the detriment of my back. It's also possible that, if well maintained, an underground storage area could keep pests such as rats at bay, making it more difficult for them to gain entry. If well designed, I mean, I know that might sound like a stretch, but in some situations, if you imagine something that's carved out of rock, and has one entrance,
you're not going to get mouse holes in the wall.
Yeah.
But also that potentially explains why they appear to have been swept and kept clean.
Absolutely. There's also the question of storage space, so putting foods and other goods underground keeps them away from prying eyes, and should bandits roll through your town, you can keep your winter supplies hidden, meaning you and your family have a better chance of survival. The problem with the food storage hypothesis is in the way the Erdstalls were designed, however. Many have segments that fill up with water regularly because they are below the water table. This could be down to error in 1 or 2 instances, but 1,000 years ago people would have taken food storage very seriously. In fact, it was...
Yeah, but do you know, if there's sections that were filling up with water though, Michael, right? Imagine sections of your pantry fill up with water. Imagine this is a pantry. But then say that you have perishables that you want to keep down there. You want to keep them cold. You put the perishables inside an animal skin and maybe hang them in the water.
Yeah.
Keeps it colder maybe. The way that you might put some beer cans in the sink to cool them down fast so that you can have a quick cold beer.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe that was intentional as well.
Maybe. My only thing with that is that just moisture and food preservation normally it's problematic usually. But no, I get what you're saying. Like waters also could be used as like a cooling system to cool the air and all that.
Imagine like amphors of wine sitting in the water, maybe like, and they're waterproof. They're maybe ceramic. But then again, have they ever found any of this stuff in any of those tunnels?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing.
You would think that they would have found one that just hadn't been cleared out.
Yeah.
One in all the hundreds, and yet they haven't.
Archaeologists believe they should have found some evidence of food particles, and as far as I'm aware, they haven't. So this also seems to rule out hiding contraband.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, maybe it was a widespread custom to hide goods from either bandits or taxation, but again, the tunnels just don't seem to be designed for that.
Yeah, probably not. In terms of like, how could they have gone unrecorded? People are not going to write down and talk about anything they're doing that's illicit. But yeah, as you say, it's a strange design for it.
Yeah. So speaking of hiding food, what about hiding people? Could the Erdstalls have been a way for people to hide from marauders and other attacking enemies? We know people have done this before. In Turkey, there is the incredible underground city known as Derinkuyu, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, which seems to have been designed to sustain as many as 20,000 people with livestock and food stores during attacks, sealing themselves underground and only coming out once things were safe. So could the Erdstalls be something similar? Again, look to their construction. The passageways are so small and even treacherous in places that the idea of people living down there for any amount of time seems far-fetched. But despite this criticism, researcher and archivist Josef Weichenberger believes that the Erdstalls found under Austria were built 1,000 years ago during a period when settlers came down from Bavaria and encountered Hungarian clans known as the Magyar tribes. During continued conflict, which is a matter of record, villagers could have dug the Erdstalls and specifically hid underground when their enemies appeared. What's interesting about Weichenberger's account of things is that he claims there is written evidence for once that the Erdstalls were used in this way.
Right.
He says there is an old written account of a woman hiding from bandits in an Erdstall and smothering her own baby to avoid being found. Weichenberger and his colleagues even tested their theory. The Erdstalls were used to hide by staying inside of one for 48 hours with only candles and an oxygen detector for company. The candle flames would flicker as they ran out of oxygen, and when the detector beeped, Weichenberger and his colleagues would move to another tunnel section. He seems to think this proves that people could have survived down there, but I actually think he might have disproved his own theory. Edith Bednarik, who is an Austrian spelunker and has vast experience of moving around underground, claims Weichenberger's theory is completely wrong. She cites the lack of any escape exit, which is what you mentioned earlier, Martin. The fact that a fire would turn the tunnels into a death trap. Also explaining that most Erdstalls don't have large gallery chambers, and, worse still, that pregnant women would not have been able to move through the tunnels at all because of the narrow design.
Yeah, because of the size.
One thing people would try to protect in those circumstances would be pregnant women, and so that does make this theory suspect as well.
You know, as well, it doesn't preclude the fact that they may have been used for that purpose, but were they built for the question is, were they built for that purpose? It doesn't seem that way. You can imagine maybe if there were hundreds of these being built, that some of them may have been built in such a hurry that they were too small to be comfortably used by people. Yes, I would accept that, but not all of them.
Yeah.
From what you've described, they all seem to be built to a particular scale that doesn't quite suit adult humans.
It's strange, isn't it? It's really bizarre.
Yeah, it's weird. It does keep bringing us back to that kind of idea of the little people and at least beliefs in those kind of creatures.
So if they weren't hiding places and they weren't escape routes from castles or to store food, we have to inevitably consider the sacred explanation. Were these tunnels carved as places of worship, or perhaps as even places to store the dead? One theory following this train of thought states that the Erdstalls were dug to house bodies until the second coming of Christ, when they would rise up on Judgment Day. But
turns out he's already been, and they got up and went.
Exactly. Major twist. But if the bodies were stored down there, where are they? Well, some historians argue that in the 12th century, a huge shift in Christian theology took place. In the past, European Christianity largely stated that people would have to wait until Christ returned before finding out whether they would enter the kingdom of heaven or not. But from the 12th century onward, that view changed. Instead, the Catholic Church decreed that people would actually go through a limbo period of judgment known as purgatory, and then they could ascend to heaven after their sins were cleaned. The theory goes that once people believed in the spiritual realm of purgatory, bodies no longer needed to be kept in the Erdstalls and could be buried in a grave. But why have we not found any forgotten Erdstalls with the dead still resting inside? Are we to believe that of the many thousands of these tunnels, none of them were forgotten about?
Plus, you know, catacombs and underground vaults for the dead do exist, and they have recognisable archaeology. This doesn't match. They wouldn't just be like straight tunnels. You would have things like the little antechambers to place the bodies in.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting theory, and I can't write it off because I don't really know, but to me it just doesn't really answer it either, because underground tombs have existed for millennia, and yet these appear to be made to a whole different design.
Yeah.
With a whole different purpose, you know. And the fact they've not found any forgotten pieces of people, or...
You would expect to find something, surely.
And maybe they will one day.
Maybe.
Looking at some of the pictures that I've seen, I'm trying to think how they would use these to store the dead. Because there's just, for a lot of them, okay, they are somewhat complex in their layout. But if you imagine, like, each of those little tunnels, each of those little passageways, there's really, like, only room to place, like, one body at a time. And then you've got to imagine people are coming in and out with new ones. Yeah. How do you get around it? It's not really particularly well designed for that either.
Yeah, well, I've thought about the idea of purgatory as an explanation, and it actually got my imagination going, so I'm going to suggest something myself, Martin.
All right.
The tunnels are arduous to pass through. They don't seem to be places where you could live for long or in comfort. Ideas such as purgatory, or the bardos found in Tibetan Buddhism, which are these difficult stages your soul must go through to be reborn, well, the Erdstalls almost seem to be like a literal interpretation of this idea in some way. So I can imagine some lost spiritual tradition where bodies or the relatives of the deceased had to make the journey through an Erdstall as some sort of spiritual rites of passage, a symbolic journey of cleansing one's soul through experiencing struggle.
Yeah, like an actual hermetic, Gnostic...
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that does make sense. If you think about it, you can look at things like in Christianity, the building of the cathedrals, it took decades, hundreds of years in some cases, like whole communities would be given over to doing that. Then you go further back and you find the same type of religious behaviour in prehistoric or very early history, pre-Christian, Stonehenge, the standing stones, Avebury, in Scotland. All around the world you get things like this where essentially once mankind got to the point where every minute was not spent looking for food and hunting, we're kind of got idle hands now, we've got time off, and it's almost like we now need to have a task that puts our eye on a sort of higher level, a higher goal, and it brings the community together as we build these things. And usually these things are great big phallic stones, right? Or they're like down in Wiltshire, they built a hill, you know, Silbury Hill, and dug giant ditches and created like avenues for, it was all symbolic for the journey of the dead and stuff like you're saying. But essentially what
the pyramids are probably the greatest example of that.
Yes,
well, if that's what the purpose was, we have to say that. But
pyramids are under the same category, right? But pyramids are slightly different because that was like a centrally controlled. There was a dictator essentially saying, go and build these, right? What I mean is, like, in every case where you look around and you see a standing stone or a stone circle in Scotland, a lot of those would have just been like the local community, whatever their religion was at the time, you know, getting together and deciding to do this to ensure a good harvest, or whatever the kind of underlying reason was, or, you know, the local religious leader decided. So what I'm getting at is that has been a continuing thread ever since agriculture essentially came along. That's been like a continuing thread in the sort of human experience. Now we've got other things to distract our attention. We've got podcasts and everything else, but people would be at a loose end and they would have this thing that they did, and maybe for generations they all worked on it. It brought the community together. It helped bind people together. It kept idle hands busy, and it promoted their culture and their religion. So it could be another example of that. Rather than digging a chalk horse in the side of a hill, these people were just digging tunnels, and that was maybe that did have some significance in the symbolism of whatever religious belief was behind it. Yeah,
it just struck me when I was looking at the descriptions of them and looking at the various sacred interpretations. So the idea of it being a symbolic journey, cleansing one's soul through struggle, like, it was just a thought. But
no, I think it's an astute one. I think it is. Can I say one more thing before we move away from the religious aspect, though? Although I agree with you that it does sound possible that there could be a religious basis, and it's what occurred to me, and obviously I agree with what you're saying, and that kind of spurred me to have that thought that's similar to these other big religious projects that in the Neolithic times were commonplace. But I think there is a common fallacy that anything that doesn't make immediate sense when it comes to archaeology ends up being attributed to religion because, well, we can't figure out why else they would do it.
It's almost like an inverted God of the Gaps argument.
Yes, exactly. I'm sure a lot of times it's correct, but if you think about it, like a lot of artifacts that exist today might not make immediate sense to an archaeologist in the future.
It's a fertility idol.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
That's the one that people say all the time. Oh, this one's got big feet. It's a fertility idol.
So if you imagine, you know the statues of the lions at the Cenotaph in Glasgow?
Yeah.
You know the big stone lions? London, you've got the stone lions at Nelson's Column and whatever else, big stone lions at the start of Ghostbusters outside the library, whatever there.
Beautiful. And
it's something we all recognise and sort of tacitly accept as part of that whole, as part of the kind of visual language that's been built up. But someone in thousands of years out of our context might see all these lion statues all around the world, thousands of miles from the nearest wild lion, and think, well, this is evidence of some lion worshipping cult that existed. Of course, what else could it be? And yet it must be like a powerful fertility symbol, you know. And maybe when we look back and we attribute things to being, yes, this is clearly religious because we can't work out what else it could possibly be, maybe that is slightly oversimplifying just because we're so far away from the context in which those things. I'm just saying that. I'm not saying that
things get lost along the way, definitely. I mean,
although I actually think that's the best suggestion so far. I think we do still need to be kind of careful with that as well.
Yeah, there are no clear answers here, but that could be a tagline to the podcast. There are no clear answers here. So the idea of it being a symbolic journey, like that thought brings us to the biggest mystery of all, which is, why is there little or no record or mention of the Erdstalls from those who lived around them, especially if they were sacred or important? For structures like these to be so ubiquitous throughout the continent, and rumours of others as far as perhaps even the Middle East, you would think the history books would be filled with detailed descriptions of how they were dug, who created them, and for what purpose. But there is almost nothing written about them pertaining to their origin. There are descriptions of people using them for other purposes later on, as you mentioned, but even those people from the 1300s and beyond had no idea why they had originally been built. At least that's the way it seems. So perhaps the Erdstalls were created to house a forbidden ritual or religion, one many took part in, but no one liked to openly discuss for fear of persecution. We know that, especially in the Middle Ages, persecution of heretics was rife, with many people being killed in sometimes the most barbaric ways simply for being a member of a different religious order. Could the Erdstalls be a series of forgotten places where those practicing pagan beliefs, people could maybe practice their beliefs away from prying eyes, or could these have been the product of a religious movement or cult that we have never even encountered before? Looking at the cult hypothesis, it's not entirely out with the realms of possibility. For example, there are various Mysterian cults from ancient Greece and Roman times that we know existed, but we have very little knowledge about what they believed. And there's even the Greco-Roman Mithraism cult that built underground chambers as places of worship, though we don't know much about their rituals. But these cults and religious orders are at least mentioned in places. The idea that there would not be a single mention of this mysterious cult building the Erdstalls, it's not impossible, but it seems unlikely.
Well, I'll tell you what, a lot of those religions, the Greco-Roman ones, you hear about the phrase mystery religion.
Yeah.
And I don't know much about them. This is just coming off the cuff, so some of these details may not be correct. But my understanding of mystery religion is that when you first joined as an outsider, you didn't really know what it was all about, and then you uncovered more and more of the religion's mysteries, and more things were revealed to you. So these could be something that is only revealed to you once you become an adept inside the cult. You reach a certain level, and therefore there's no external outsiders wouldn't know about it.
Scientology.
I was going to say, it's like Xenu. But yeah, it could well be that hidden knowledge and all of that stuff, you have to get to a certain level in the organisation before we tell you about the ghost tunnels,
Even organisations like the Knights Templar that built many hiding places beneath the ground.
Yeah, the Knights Templar.
Probably too young to be the architects of the Erdstalls. Although people who identify with the Knights Templar would maybe argue against that and say that they're much older. But there are some legitimate researchers, such as Heinrich Kusch, a PhD who some regard as one of the world's leading experts in underground man-made structures, believes that the Erdstalls are much, much older than 1,000 years. He believes they are around 5,000 years old, mostly, and there is tantalising evidence for a much larger network of these tunnels that span the continent. However, when he's trying to come up with an explanation for who built these tunnels...
Aliens.
Yeah, well, he's actually, at least he sidesteps that sort of idea, but his work in this area has come under criticism for being too speculative in places. And although he cites the recent discovery of a manuscript in a monastery which shows networks of tunnels underground, he hasn't actually found any of them yet, though he's still looking, drilling down in search of what he calls the gateway to the underworld. Before we head off into more bizarre territory, explanations, it's fascinating that a legitimate scientific explanation lays the blame of the Erdstalls firmly at the feet of our ancestors, Martin. Some archaeologists have suggested that Celtic monks, perhaps from Scotland and Ireland, were behind the Erdstalls, and that some of the Erdstalls and where they're placed seem to follow the route that these monks took when they went on their I don't know if they would have called them missionaries at that time, but as early as the 6th or 7th century. It's been suggested that these monks brought with them parts of their Celtic heritage, including more ancient practices such as perhaps building things like Erdstalls, which would explain why they are found here in Scotland as well. That seems to be a theory that a lot of archaeologists are kind of looking at seriously.
It comes back to what I was saying about like their sort of hermetic traditions. And that can be within or out with Christianity. That could be, even within Christianity, you had these people like the early Christian mystics almost, who lived on these desolate islands, and you know, this is the kind of thing, almost like go and live in a cave for a year, dig yourself a cave and live in it, and you'll become closer to God, or you'll become...
Philosophical traditions are full of that as well.
So, and you know what, it could also be a bit of all of these, because you could have a convergent thing where several disparate groups of people may be influenced by what each other have done.
I don't have my notes in front of me here, but I think it was in that Der Spiegel article that I think they mentioned this theory, and they mentioned that there had been an Irish monk who'd been buried somewhere, maybe in the mainland in Europe, and they mentioned maybe the word they used was similar to Erdstall. So I think that's as well why they sort of, they're linking that to this. Okay, so Martin, we've talked sense for far too long.
Time to talk some shite.
Yeah, are you ready for a brief trip into the weird?
Yeah. They're never brief. We're going all the way.
So, how about the Erdstalls being a Mandrake cave? Now, I only found one mention of this, and it could be a dodgy translation. So, I had to put a few things together myself to make this idea make sense. So, I'm sure some of our listeners may correct me on this, but let's go with it for now. So, for those who don't know, the mandrake is an infamous plant whose its root can sometimes look humanoid, almost like a strange plant baby. In witchcraft circles, it was long believed that if you dug the mandrake up out of the soil, it would let out a curse scream that would kill anyone who heard it. Right now there are a bunch of Harry Potter fans nodding knowingly. But mandrake is also a powerful hallucinogen and was used in various medicines before modern medicine came along, including being used to knock people out as a form of anaesthetic. But it was also really important for witchcraft and could be used to create talismans for fertility and protection. The dilemma then was, how do you get this prized root out of the ground without hearing the death scream? Now, I know from previous research that people actually put some thought into this. One way was to tie a piece of rope to a dog and then to the top of the plant while it was still on the ground, and the owner of the dog would then start running, and when the dog bolted following its master, the rope would tear the plant out of the ground without anyone being next to it.
It was quite a quiet scream then.
Yeah, so when I saw a mention of the Erdstalls as being Mandrake caves, if that's the correct translation, it made kind of perfect sense to me in a weird way. You have a place underground, perhaps with a shaft to allow some light in, Remember the shafts that were filled in after construction that we mentioned?
Right.
In the Type B Erdstalls. You grow Mandrake down in the Erdstall, then you block the light shaft, tie some rope to the plants from the only remaining exit, some
a whole Rube Goldberg contraption on how to pull these things up out the ground.
And then you pull them out, the ground acting as a kind of soundproofing. And I know it's a really, really big stretch, but the thought entered my mind when I saw...
Okay, but here's a theory. You want to get that out of the ground, you don't want to hear it scream. A really long piece of rope. There's no digging involved, just a really long piece of rope.
That's why, you can think far more literally than I can. That's problem solved. No tying to a dog.
Dog's needless complication. You've got like a magnifying glass up at the sun and a rope with like a ton weight on it and a chicken laying an egg on a wee...
The thing is, I was just thinking... It's kind of a little bit like Willy Wonka, we were thinking about the Oompa Loompas and all that down there. So, lastly, what about the Cryptid Connection? The language used to describe Erdstalls invokes small creatures that hide away from society, only ever coming out to cause mischief. Elves, gnomes, and even goblins have their place in European folklore and have been connected to the tunnels. It's of course speculation of the highest order, but in almost every society in the world, there are stories about small humanoid creatures. Mm-hmm. Could there have been a small type of hominid? Not unlike Flores Man from Indonesia, the small 3-foot tall hominid that seems to have lived until somewhere between 50,000 and 12,000 years ago. I understand there's controversy about that. That's easily young enough to have entered the mythological stories from around the world. Perhaps they kept their dead down there or even lived down there as a last gasp attempt to avoid the relentless march of Homo sapiens. Then, being seen as monstrous, their existence was wiped clean from the tunnels for good, leaving us to question what the hell these tunnels actually are, or who knows, maybe the hope of 10-year-old me still has something to cling on to, and there is a civilization of strange creatures still living somewhere in the depths of the earth.
You hope that that's true?
Probably not, but it's enjoyable to question those sorts of things, isn't it?
Imagine you'd stumbled on that in your 6-foot deep shaft in the back garden and you look down and there's just all these little Oompa Loompa looking guys looking up at you.
On their computers.
Flying around in wee buggies like the Jetsons.
And we always say we leave the door open, even just a fraction, for any explanation, no matter how unlikely. Because you really never know what's out there or down there. I will say this though about the cryptid hypothesis. In some of the main chambers of Erdstalls, there have been found a few strange or unusual building blocks and remnants of doors or locks. Now, I don't know what they mean by that. It was in that article, so I don't know if they're talking about the way things have been carved into the rock, or if they're talking about actual pieces of locks, maybe from later on that have been put down there, or I don't know. But in one particular Erdstall near the town of Lindau, they found a sandstone carving depicting a goblin with a tail.
Wow.
And so some believe the Erdstalls are either gateways to strange creatures or other worlds, or maybe they were used as prisons for such creatures to keep them away from the human population. But you had some other ideas as well, I think.
I actually thought of, in Iceland, there's a tradition of building what's known as elf houses. So there's a traditional belief in the existence of elves, that elves inhabit the land and that they have some kind of sway over a lot of things in both domestic life and maybe agricultural, the weather, who knows, right? So the elves are unhappy. The crops failed, our cattle's dying. How do we get them on side? How do we butter them up? So in Iceland there's a tradition of building these homes for the little people, fae people, and basically what they make is little doll's house looking things. And they would build them, put them out in the wild or out in the garden as a transaction to ensure good luck, good harvest, etc. Because if you've built a house for them, then they're like, this guy's okay, I'm gonna make sure he has good luck, I'm going to make sure he has a good harvest, that his animals are safe, that his family's safe.
He built me some central heating.
Yeah.
this guy's getting the good stuff.
Since there is a tradition around dwarfs being underground dwellers, and I think you mentioned before that some of the names for these tunnels...
Goblin Hole and that sort of thing.
They actually inherited the names of some of these sort of fantastical creatures, and the legends around the tunnels maybe belonging to magical creatures and being carved out by them. Could it be that actually what was happening was because they believed that dwarves were living down there, or they believed that dwarves were living on the land, and that by building them a place to live, they were gaining their favour? And that would, to me, that would explain why these are all built to a semi-standard size, but that size being too small for an adult human being. It would also explain why it would seem that there was nothing left inside them. It seemed like they'd never really be used, most of them, because you would build it and go, there you go, that's your little house now, seal it up, and hope that, you know, the next harvest comes good because you've given them a favour, you're expecting one in return. So it could be something like that, you know. It could be trying to gain the favour of spirits of the land, that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, or it was punishment for children.
Child prison.
You've done something bad. Children can fit down there. On you go.
That's true.
No, I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's fascinating because, like you say, it shows the power of folklore. Like, even if these things don't exist, believing that they do can significantly impact things. So, like you say, like if people were building these, sort of undertaking these huge sort of digging projects just out of that belief, it's pretty incredible. But do you know, I think it's fitting that we end tonight's excursion into mysterious archaeology by returning to Lambert Carner.
Okay.
That's the intrepid priest who explored the tunnels in the late 1800s. Carner's work led him to receive the Knight's Cross of the Franz Joseph Order in 1904, and he even had a road named after him. Well done, you got a road named after you, big guy. Perhaps most fitting of all, he was affectionately referred to as the Cave Pastor.
Right.
That made me wonder if, you know, I've been using the term priest because that was in one of the translations.
What's his name again?
Lambert Carner. So I'm wondering if he actually wasn't a Catholic priest. Lambert Carner, Karner.
Karner. Lambert Carner. So, does say pastor, son of a master, leather master, apparently.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to read that because I can't pronounce it. It mentions an abbey that he studied at.
And a monk, yeah.
And the abbey he studied at was a Benedictine abbey, so he was Catholic.
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you. So, as I said, he was affectionately referred to as the Cave Pastor and gave many talks on the subject of Erdstalls. His essays are still being studied today within the field of Erdstall exploration. In 1909, Lambert Carner tragically died of a lung condition which people assumed to be tuberculosis at the time.
Right.
Now, it's interesting that in 1994, researchers Mosquera, Rodrigo and Gonzalez determined that the risk of tuberculosis was 3 times as great for coal miners as it was for the general population, and that was for miners living in the 1970s and 80s, who had much better protective gear than from 100 years previous. So now, of course, that's related to black lung and breathing in coal dust, but I thought it was an interesting footnote, if a man's death can ever be described as a footnote, that perhaps Lambert Carner was the very first recorded victim of the Erdstall tunnels themselves. So his life and pursuit as an amateur scientist should not be forgotten, nor should the efforts of anyone who attempts to shine a light on newly discovered phenomena, no matter how strange. So what do you think, Martin?
I think it's really, really interesting. It's a slightly different kind of mystery to the sort of mysteries we've covered so far on Talking Till Dawn. We've done a little bit of true crime, we've done a little bit of paranormal. This is just like a nice, interesting...
Yeah.
It's not gory and gruesome and, you know, that side of thing. And it's not completely off in the realms of the fantastical. They're definitely real artifacts. And there's genuine uncertainty about what they are. So I find it fascinating. It's also the kind of mystery that I like because it's the sort of mystery that perhaps in our lifetime we will know the answer.
Yeah.
You know? There's a lot of mysteries that we will probably never know about the wow signal, or we'll probably never really know clearly what happened at Roswell. But there's a chance that someone could crack this.
Yeah.
It feels like there's an answer there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And there'll be some record, someone will find something, I think, in this. Maybe not within our lifetime, but it seems like there's a more concrete possibility of that happening than for some of the things that we talk about.
Yeah.
So that's quite refreshing.
I mean, yeah, plus it's good to start with something that you know. I mean, we're open-minded about things, but We try to show both sides, the critical side and the more open-minded side when we're exploring different topics. But it's when you have a topic that you know this is real, this is something that's concrete, and it's a mystery. It's exciting for me, and I hope people have enjoyed listening. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, most of the written work on this is from Germany. It's an area that is criminally understudied.
Yeah.
It seems really strange to me that it's so understudied when there are so many of these things going around. But I do want to give special mention to the article in Der Spiegel by Matthias Schultz. I used several sources for tonight's episode during my research, but his article was invaluable and I highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah, will do.
But we'll leave a link to all of the sources. I've got a list of them and we can put them in the show notes. But definitely, it's, sometimes we always try to look at things from numerous different sources, and I did that for this episode, but I feel like I learned so much from that article that it's really important to mention that and give credit.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I would like to dig into like how they're laying the boundaries between these tunnels and just other kinds of tunnels.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned briefly that there was some talk of there being some outside of mainland Europe, that there may have been some in Scotland.
Yeah.
And further afield. I'd like to look more into that.
I would love to know about the ones in Scotland. I didn't specifically focus on them. I would assume that because they've broken them down into categories, that there must be something which connects them.
Mostly I've been looking it up while we've been talking. Most of the actual kind of semi-authoritative writing on Erdstalls mentions that they're sort of Germany, Bavaria, Central Europe, that sort of area. If any really genuinely do exist outside of there, yeah, that opens up a whole other range of questions about who did it, and was this a cultural movement, or was there like a profession of an Erdstall builder and these people travelled around Europe, whether it was to appease the little people or whether it was for people to go down and whatever it was they did.
But that's one thing I would say though, is that one thing that's certain about these tunnels is it was a skilled endeavour.
Yeah.
They were built, especially the larger ones, were built by people who had probably done it before.
Yeah.
Or, had that knowledge. If those notches in the walls were for lanterns and things like that, then there was forethought put into them. But they're just really strange structures, and I would love to know what they are. I mean, in my heart of heart, I hope, like some people have suggested, that they're as old as 12,000 years. I'm sure they're probably not, but wouldn't it be wonderful if they were?
Yeah, that would be amazing. I am doubtful about the guy that was saying the door to the underworld and they are all linked together. We just haven't found. I do have to admit my kind of doubts that.
Oh, definitely.
Just thinking about the distances involved, like walking the distances, never mind chiseling out those distances would be. He's
written, Heinrich Kusch was his name, and he's written, with his wife, has written a couple of books on the subject. I never got them, but they are. If you look at the reviews of those books, there's totally split. There's like loads of people that like these books are incredible, and then I saw one review in particular that I had to get the translation for because it was in German, but the reviewer spends a couple of paragraphs saying how amazing the books are and like how much of a good read they are, and it feels like they've been so systematic in what they've done and so great, and then in the last paragraph they're like, then you find out it's all bunk. Which I thought was quite funny because he said he's like, they've never actually stepped foot in the tunnels that they're describing. They're describing tunnels with intricate carvings and things like that. So they're saying that they're looking for these types of tunnels that they think are connected to the Erdstalls, but I don't know. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the lack of really good clues that's what makes this mystery, I guess. The fact that they were cleaned and empty, and there's so many of them, and yet we've never found one that just so happens to have had a bunch of stuff left in it that would answer the question about all of them.
Couple of VHSs and
time travelers. It's time travelers.
Yeah, that's it. That's the go-to solution. Time travelers or aliens, or time traveling aliens. I find it fascinating, and from what I can read, one of the reasons that these sorts of things are understudied is that there's at least the belief that sometimes when you're looking at either history as an academic pursuit or archaeology, these sorts of things, that when anomalous things are found, there's a level of resistance towards them, and that maybe people don't get as excited about them because they try to explain them within the existing framework. And I think that happens in a lot of scientific pursuits. That doesn't mean that they're wrong.
But then again, that is the application of Occam's razor, isn't it? You do have to be kind of careful, because it's easy to go on the other side and run away with something, and then actually you just end up looking like a tit because. So it's a balancing act.
I think if we've learned anything from tonight, it's make sure you get a coal survey in case you've got a shaft underneath your house that's depth unknown.
Don't get shafted.
Aye, imagine it was an Erdstalls. It'd be amazing.
Guys, thank you to everyone who has previously left us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I've not said this the last few times, Mike.
Go for it.
Hello to everyone who's said hello on YouTube and to everyone who's followed us on Twitter. I mainly deal with the Twitter side of things for Talking Till Dawn, so if you reach out to us there, chances are you'll get me. Mike is more the Facebook guy, so if you reach out to us on Facebook, you'll get Mike. Follow us there if you want to be kept abreast of what we've got incoming, or just to say hello if you want to ask us a question.
Topic suggestions as well.
Won't guarantee that we'll do every topic suggestion, but always interesting to hear what people would like to hear. It's good to know what the audience wants. Gives us a direction to move in, so absolutely share your topic suggestions or anything that you just think we should have a look at, and you just want to know what we think, or you want to just say hello. Please do get in touch. If you enjoy these episodes and you want to help us out, the best thing you can do is share the podcast with any like-minded friends or family. But yeah, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll love you for it until our dying breath.
Until the little people come out of the Erdstalls
and drag us down.
The Goblin King comes out and he looks like David Bowie. But anyway, Martin, I think the sun is coming up.
Michael, it's been a pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure. Right, thank you, everyone.
Safe journey.
Where am I going?
I don't know, down the pit.